Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. If you'd like me to read your stories, whether they be series or one-shots, head over to Reddit and send me a message on the incorrectly spelled aggro squirrels, and I'll add you to the list of approved authors that I pull stories from. Anyways, on to the story. The Humans Poke Back, written by Sneaky the Lost. Ambassador Jim Trescott reached for the bottle of medication, having found the viscous pink fluid necessary as more information concerning the assault on New Tatooine unfolded. Part of him was sickened that he'd played a part in what happened, that he'd been played by politicians back home. Over 25 million confirmed dead now, almost half of the population of the planet, not to mention everyone that was in the orbitals or out in the belts. Maybe some politician had thought that it would require a horror like this to justify what was certainly to come. And maybe that politician was right. But it was still an indelible stain on the personal honor, a blot that would remain until the day he died. A day that will come later than for those souls who had been in the Hanth's way. The Hanth ambassador sneered when he didn't show up in the next Galactic Council meeting. It assumed that he was traumatized by the loss, and that he was too afraid to show himself. Well, there was trauma from the tragedy, yes. That wasn't why he didn't attend. He didn't trust himself, and it would be a poor accounting of human diplomacy to personally kill the dirty bug with his own bare hands. However costly the price, at least the mothball fleet had become ready, and in far shorter time than he had feared it would. That was another indicator of his suspicion that someone had deliberately permitted this atrocity to occur. Political wheels had moved far too rapidly to have not been planned out in advance. The other thing, the faint silver lining, is that it was now proven beyond a shadow of a doubt what the Hanths were willing and able to do if they think they can get away with it. They've demonstrated to humanity the danger they represent, far clearer than any report, be it ever so strongly worded. After all, if they'd done this with some level of civility, if they'd simply conquered without committing wanton slaughter, things might have turned out very differently. But they demonstrated what they were capable of. Now, it was humanity's turn, and the galaxy at large will see what humanity is capable of when you insist on war without rules. May God have mercy upon us all, Jim thought to himself, and may the rest of the galaxy at large be willing to speak to us again after they see what coin we pay in kind with. Fleet Admiral Kacharum of the Hanth Imperial Navy was not amused. What do you mean that we haven't secured the surface yet? It's been over 2 weeks, and these are supposedly civilians. Why haven't they been pacified yet? Are your troops afraid of civilians with no significant weapons to speak of? General Pat Kai Lowell met the Admiral's gaze evenly. I lost nearly a quarter of the invasion force on the first day of landing, Admiral. I won't have the courage of my soldiers insulted. A quarter? How by the first egg did you lose so many? I knew you were of a secondary calf hive, but I didn't realize that they'd sent a complete incompetent to handle the job. The Fleet Admiral sneered at the General. How? Because it's a mining colony. You vacuum-sucking ingrate. Those stinking savages still use explosives. Yes, they use actual chemical explosives to do mining with, which also works quite well as improvised munitions. The entire initial landing blew up when we made the mistake of using their own landing pads, only to discover them to be rigged. I lost nearly 1/10 of our assault shuttles in an afternoon. But down in the mines, it's actually worse. They don't hesitate to collapse their own tunnels on us. Even if it doesn't catch many anymore, it still blocks lines of aggression until the rubble can be cleared and the tunnels reinforced, which delays action still further. It's not like I'm getting an orbital support like I was supposed to, Fleet Admiral. The mines are too deep, General. I can blow up any surface target you care to identify any moment you wish, but not even my orbital strikes can sink that deep into the ground. Admiral, priority alert from the main sensor array. We have incoming hypertube. One of the officers in the station interrupted the briefing before it could get any more heated. The Admiral and the General gave each other a glance. They may be upset with each other, but they both knew their jobs and their positions within the Imperium. The General left without further word, letting the Admiral handle the situation. "How big?" was the Admiral's first question. "Big, sir. If their hyper-equipment is on par with the galactic average, I'd say twice the mass of our fleet, maybe more," the officer on station dutifully replied. The Admiral's next command was almost instantaneous as he realized that it couldn't have been a friendly force. "Flag to all units. We have incoming hostiles. Exit orbit immediately and enter combat formation." No one wanted to be caught pinned against the planet in the face of an incoming hostile fleet, and receiving a decisive and sensible order brought a sense of calmness to the crew. If they were going to ride into combat, at least their commanders knew what to do. "Update. Unknown fleet has exited Hyper. Initial count indicates 86 independent masses." "Sciences." The Admiral was mildly surprised that the humans had scraped together so many hulls. There were, according to his sources, fewer than 100 vessels in their entire navy. None of them bigger than a frigate. Had those cursed Krekneth loaned them a few vessels? Dealing with the primitive was one thing, but he had a healthy respect for the molluscoids and their proper naval vessels. "CIC has identified 30 ships massing somewhere between destroyer and cruiser class, 30 somewhere between cruiser and battleship class, 20 which mass in the 5% larger than any known battleship class, and 6 which are roughly the size of Pollux-class cargo vessels." "Yeah. Are any identifiable as being of Krekneth make?" The Admiral doubted it, given the oddball sizes reported, but that was the only way to explain what must be 6 missile colliers, unless they were troop transports, expecting to have to retake the planet on the ground. Negative, sir. None of the vessels are even remotely in the right mass readings for any known Krekneth vessel. Querying CIC to determine origin, the officer was busy with its console. The Admiral was pleased with its subordinate. It had accurately predicted what the Admiral's next order was, and was already executing it. "Good. Now, I don't know where these ships come from, but with 6 missile colliers, they're clearly conveniently equipped, which means they might actually put up a fight. So moved into defensive formation Bravo until we know what we're dealing with." "Sir, the enemy has launched," another member of the tactical team reported. "What? From this range?" The enemy fleet was still dozens of light minutes away. Did they expect to use ballistic phases between stages to try and clear the gap? The Admiral did not dare countermand his previous fleet order, or try to shift its formation into a new one while under fire. The term order, counter-order, disorder sprung firmly to his mind. Update. The launch appears to be some kind of drone. They certainly aren't launching like the standard missile patterns, at least," the officer in the sensor watch replied. Ah, drones. That made more sense. Everyone in the galaxy knew about drones. Basically longer range but slower missiles, really. More maneuverable, bigger drives, but easy targets for counter-missiles. And they were bulky enough that you couldn't mass them like you could missiles in oversaturated missile defenses. About what he'd expect from the primitives. Still, with those 6 cargo vessels behind to feed them into continuous supply, they were at least a threat to be respected. "Tactical. Pass the defense officer the trace. DO, keep a hard track on those drones, and keep your threat profile updated. They might just have legs to get here after all." "Aye, sir. But if they can't pull off more Excel than they're showing off now, I could spot them half my sensor array and still pick them off long before they get into engagement range." Yes, I know. Still, don't let your guard down. They may be a primitive sort of weapon, but at least it is an actual weapon." Sir, I have an incoming message from the hostile fleet," the communications officer spoke up. "On the main screen?" the Admiral quickly replied. He wanted to see who was courageous and stupid enough to try and pull this tactic. "I am Admiral Karl Yankov, in command of the 16th Reserve Fleet. You have attacked a civilian colony without provocation or warning, causing millions of casualties, and have invaded a Terran Federation system. This is your one and only opportunity to surrender unconditionally. Failure to do so will result in the destruction of your entire fleet. Over to you." The sad fact of sublight communications at these distances meant a significant time lag between communication requests. This message had to have been sent moments after exiting Hyper, gutsy of the fella, at least. Live Mike, the comms officer, intoned.
Admiral Yankov, I am Fleet Admiral Kacharum of the Hanth Imperial Navy. This system is now a Hanth territory. I respect your courage, even as I lament your lack of intellect. If you think a few drones are going to intimidate us, you have a lot to learn about how your betters handle combat. Allow me to give you a lesson, brief though it may be. It'll be the shame that you won't live long enough to profit from it.
He gestured to the comms officer. Mike Clear, it dutifully intoned.
Fleet command to all ships, continue in defensive formation beta until we close to a range of 10 light minutes. At that point, we shift to offensive formation alpha. All ships make ready to fire on my command at that range. Flag officer, out.
Sir, the drones appear to be keeping station with their fleet. Perhaps they are reconsidering the wisdom of their aggressive action, the tactical officer spoke up.
Doubtful. I don't know where they got their ships, but they're definitely here to die for their honor. Maybe they're worried about early proximity kills and keeping their drones within their point defense basket until they got close enough to sprint the gap.
The Admiral was thinking out loud, but it was a solid theory as any. One counter to drone wave was to set up a wide spread of proximity-fused missiles. Since they were slow and possessed no point defense to speak of, it isn't too hard to use a regular missile salvo to decimate a much larger wave of incoming drones, even before they enter actual point defense range. It was generally seen as wasteful, but it was certainly successful.
Puzzling. These humans, whatever trick they think they have, it can't be anything the galaxy hasn't seen before. Whatever ruse you think is so clever will not work. You are as good as dead.
Admiral Yankov sat in Flag Ops, overseeing the fleet, as the response came in. At the mention of drones, he sharply looked at his tactical officer. Is there any chance that they could have seen our drones? They're already out ahead by a good bit.
Doubt it, sir. At least they haven't reacted to them. Maybe they're talking about the Sting ships?
The tactical officer offered a counter-suggestion. From what Milint says, no one uses such parasite ships, which means no one has a clue of what kind of firepower those 6 Enterprise-class supercarriers can pack with their string ships. They might have mistaken them for a couple shuttle-sized suicide drones that we have a couple of reports about. Possible. In either case, do we have any kind of fix on their nav patterns yet? The Admiral didn't expect any reasonable result yet. No one would be stupid enough as to have such a simplistic evasion algorithm in the face of an enemy fleet. But the longer they got a look, the closer they got to finding a solution. As firm a lock as you can please, sir. Get this. They have no erratic maneuvers at all. Their entire fleet is moving straight as an arrow. Didn't even need to query the quantum coprocessor. The scorn in the tactical officer's voice was harsh, but not unwarranted. Quantum coprocessors were expensive toys that gave military ships their unmitigated edge in combat. Quantum processing was much hyped when someone came up with a way to do it without needing a cryogenic temperatures. But while they were enormously useful at collapsing and variable state, they could never replace conventional processors. However, they could augment them, especially when you had a very large data set of possibilities to sort through, such as decrypting an algorithm or calculating a firing solution. Well, they think in terms of missiles which still have gas left in their tanks to be able to handle erratic maneuvers. So why bother wasting the cycles evading something that will just home in on? So, from that perspective, it makes sense. But it is not going to do them any favors when we bring them in range. I'll be generous to them. Aperture-class dreadnoughts are cleared to engage at 8 light minutes if they continue to give us free shots. If there are any left, the rest of the fleet can engage as they can range.
And for the Sting ships, sir? His tactical officer prompted.
Hold position to thicken point defense until their first launch. Then we'll see from there. It was a cruel irony that their focus on energy weapons meant most of their ships had precious little in the way of systems dedicated to point defense. Of course, given their main batteries could fill the role just as well, went at least some way to mitigating that flaw. But having nearly 1,000 Sting ships with their quad-pulse lasers hanging around should help offset that deficiency. Not worried about a few missiles, sir? The tactical officer's tone of voice was the epitome of politeness. A few? No. But some of those reports have hundreds and even thousands of missiles per volley. I value my people's lives. The only thing that happens from an excess of caution is that bugs get to live a few minutes longer, after all. Don't worry, those pilots will get their chance. Never fear. We've got quite a laundry list of locations where their particular skill set will be invaluable indeed.
As you say, sir, the tactical officer replied with professional aplomb.
Missiles trace,
the sense officer announced.
Numbers,
the Admiral snapped back, more sharply than he intended. We have 350, that is 350 missiles inbound. Look pretty densely clustered as well. Our drones are getting good readings.
Isn't that all? Well, looks like we're overestimated them. Good. Message to Wing Commander. You are free to engage the incoming missiles en route to your targets. If there are any left for us to deal with, you buy the beer.
Little fear of that, the tactical officer muttered under his breath. The Admiral, with his soft smile, pretended he didn't hear it. Fleet Admiral, their drones have begun their sprint. Well, I guess one might call it a sprint if they were being generous. More like a vigorous stumble, and a disorganized one at that. The sensor officers discussed that the drone's flight path was clear, and with good reason. They could have made fairly reasonable speed had they been moving in a straight line in an organized formation. However, they weren't. The disorganized mob was more of a cloud of sensor blips than anything coherent. I suppose they must have taxed their targeting platforms with their numbers. Either that or they just don't have enough control channels and are having to rotate control.
The number of drones was impressive, no doubt. The Admiral thought to himself.
They must have flushed every single drone packed into those colliers to drum up the launch that large. But a rotating control pattern invalidates the drone's sole advantage of maneuverability. Still, one can't have that debris field masquerading as a drone swarm clutter up local space. Give me a proximity launch, just to be certain.
Perhaps he was being overly cautious, but he preferred to err on the side of caution. After all, once those drones were taken care of, his opponents were all but defenseless, and he could eliminate them at his leisure. Sir, status update. The drone swarm has, overflown our initial salvo and...
Go ahead, spit it out.
The Admiral wondered what could have affected the sensor officer so badly.
Our initial salvo, sir. It's gone, sir.
What? The Admiral shouted in shocked disbelief. The drones, sir. They appear to be outfitted with point defense clusters. They engaged that launch at a half-light minute. Since missiles didn't recognize them as a threat, they didn't even try to evade. At first, rage threatened to consume the Fleet Admiral. But logic soon followed and calmed him down.
Point defense, you say?
His tone of voice was calm and professional, almost too calm in the mind of the officers present. That appears to be the case, sir, the sensor officer confirmed.
Well, that explains why they were held back until after our launch, despite a drone's theoretical range advantage. But they got too cute for their own good.
Sir?
The officer was confused. They just shot their missile colliers dry to stop one volley. What are they going to do against the 49 others that we have just on internal tubes alone? And since those drones have point defense clusters, they aren't packed with explosives. Thus, point defense clusters are expensive to run, and you don't have room for a fusion reactor on a drone, which means that it has to be running on auxiliary battery, which was probably just spent. In other words, they're basically kinetic platforms now. A mass with engines, no threat whatsoever.
The Admiral waved an appendage and then added,
Oh sure, it's a cute trick, engaging missiles outside a point defense envelope to fool an ECCM package into ignoring it. But it isn't going to save them, not in the long run.
The Fleet Admiral reluctantly gave his flashbangs the credit where it was due. It was a clever trick, one that would have been taken into consideration in future engagements. But all the humans' reputation for unorthodox thinking won't save them from the follow-up salvos. They'd spent 6 missile colliers worth of mass to stop a single salvo. The old saw about spending millions to save dozens came to mind. He would almost pity them. Almost. All right, Fleet Order, the Aperture-class dreadnoughts, activate and tune gravitic lenses and prepare to fire, Admiral Yenkov ordered. One of the problems that had plagued directed energy weapons was a matter of attenuation. Firing a stream of photons, or whatever energy wave you like, worked better in a vacuum because they didn't have an atmospheric distortion. However, when you're talking about targets several light minutes away, the problem becomes one of focus. The beam would gradually widen until it basically became an oversized flashlight. The gravity lens was humanity's answer to that, a small concave gravity field that acted much like a focusing lens, one that could be adjusted to put the focal point on target. Of course, they weren't cheap to operate, which is why the biggest ones required something the size of a dreadnought to mount them, but it also meant that they had the furthest theoretical focal point. The bigger problem, at least against fleets that understood the threat, was a matter of aiming. Space was vast, and directed energy weapons were merely light speed. In other words, if your target was several light minutes away, it would take several minutes for your beam to reach them, and if they performed any course correction during that time, they wouldn't be in the place that you thought that they would be. This was at least partially mitigated by the quantum coprocessor, who could analyze a ship's movement patterns and, with some degree of accuracy, postulate a data set of possibilities that had a higher chance of being correct. Further, reinforcement had followed until they had a reasonable firing solution. It was rare for a first volley to actually hit, but the data recovered from the initial volley was valuable in further collapsing the dataset down to a few predictable results, and thus increasing the accuracy of the subsequent volleys. Human navigators had adapted by plotting erratic courses corrections as a normal part of their duties. Some likened it to creating a symphony using prepackaged evasion patterns as leitmotifs, which were woven together to create orderly chaos, to the utter ruination of most tracking packages, and sharply decreasing the weapon's effective range. Except that these bugs didn't understand the concept of evasive maneuvers. They had shifted their formation before they began firing, but that was the only course correction that they had made, which meant that the petawatt range main batteries on the Aperture-class dreadnoughts were about to carve through their formation like a hot knife through butter. "Have the drones identified their flagships?" the Admiral asked calmly. Combat drones had been a part of combat for longer than humanity had traveled between the stars. These days, their job was to obtain and transmit information back to their fleet. They had small but powerful FTL comms packages in them. The bandwidth wasn't much to write home about, but they didn't really need a lot of bandwidth for the numbers that they were reporting back. And it gave the Terran Federation a distinct advantage if anyone didn't get any bright ideas about attempting to maneuver. "Yes, sir. Shall we target their flagship first?" The tactical officer's grin was predatory. "By no means. They wanted to teach us a lesson. I want their flag officer to understand the magnitude of its error before it is permitted to follow its personnel. Save the enemy flagship for last." It was a small cruelty, but one that carried no consequences for his fleet. A tiny down payment on debts owed. 6 hours later, and 16 reserve fleet were in parking orbit, having sustained no casualties and having eliminated all hostile naval forces. The hand troop transports had attempted to surrender, but the problem with these distances was a matter of time. By the time the troop transports had messaged the fleet to surrender, and that message had arrived at the fleet, they had already been fired upon. Not that surrender was an option anyway, but it salved Admiral Yankov's conscience to know that he couldn't have accepted their surrender, even if he had wanted. "Holmes, send a message back to HQ. Message reached, fumigation successful, all clear to send aid." The Transstellar FTL comm was a fickle thing, with an even lower bandwidth than the in-system version. Worse, anyone who actually knew how they functioned might be able to listen in if they were within the line of effect, which is why they were routinely sent in code. He wasn't a hyperphysicist. He didn't know exactly how it worked, nor did he need to in order to use it. But it was something that no one else apparently had, an advantage humanity intended to keep under its cap for as long as they could. It would take a few days for the Red Cross to send the humanitarian aid fleet. In the meantime, his boys had some initial search and rescue to do. Half of the Sting ships were on SAR patrols in the belts and the debris of the orbital stations that hadn't deorbited yet, searching for any signs of emergency life pods. He didn't have much hope at this point, but any hope was better than none. Admiral Yankov wondered how the other reserve fleets were handling their missions. He was very grateful for the increased automation of the reserve ships. A single naval patrol frigate crew could just about operate one of the Kilroy-class cruisers if they had to, despite the cruiser being almost 20 times the size. Heck, even the dreadnoughts were able to be crewed by no more than twice the frigate's crew allotment, although most of those extra bodies were in weapons targeting and engineering stations. It meant that they could actually crew the ships that had been pulled out of mothball from the Great War without needing to resort to conscription. and it meant that their response could be had in weeks rather than years that it would take to train up even the green crews. Part of him was frankly a little terrified at the capabilities they had deliberately set aside when these vessels had been put into a parking orbit with their atmosphere vented. Now he fully understood exactly what these ships were capable of. He knew why they were mothballed. They were too good at what they did. The temptation to misuse them would have been tremendous, but floating out in a parking orbit carefully shielded, they'd suffered no corrosion. It was like opening a time capsule, perfectly pristine and preserved in a vacuum of space, ready to be put into service once again, should a sufficient threat arise. And now that one has, these great giants of war have once again been filled with a terrible resolve and set into motion, and they shall not rest until that threat has been neutralized. End of story. I would just like to thank our T5 members, Lord Azrakal, Ambrose Cattell, Quantum Wednesday, Dragzoon WRE, Blueberry Cat, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Bushmaster 177, and Leslie 517. Thank you very much.